Welcome to Reality is Undefeated. I'm at Gatewood. Thank you for tuning in. Shout out to every writer that contributed to the ending of Snowfall. I am so glad it ended the way it ended. In the day and age we live in, everyone loves a success story. But there are so many stories that end in the opposite manner that never get told. The crack era took place from before I was born into my early childhood. So I don't know anyone who sold crack during that era, but I know many who sold throughout the 90s. And what I could say is that the money that was in the hood in the 80s that flowed through wasn't present in the 90s. Yeah, there was still some money there. Still lots of gold chains, although much smaller. Gold Daytons on Cadillac DeVilles and Eldorados. Lincoln Continentals and town cars. Oldsmobile Cutlass Supremes, Buick Regals, and lots of Chevys. Monte Carlos, Caprices, Camaros, Impalas, El Caminos, and Blazers. The women wore big hoop earrings and curled their hair and chewed gum with an emphasis. The fellas, we was in Dickies and Anchor Blues, Pro Clubs and flannels, and put fat laces in our Chucks, our Cortez, our K-Swiss. The music was fresh. Cube had a good day. Dre and Snoop told us it's nothing but a G thing. Warren G and Nate Dogg was regulating. And Mac 10 let us know that this is for life. This is the early to mid 90s on the West Coast. And what I just described sounds vibrant and honestly refreshing, as it brings back a lot of nostalgia. And for most of us, brings back a moment in time that we wouldn't mind going back to spend one more day waiting on our favorite music video to show in the box, or waiting on that ice cream truck, whichever came first. But there are many of us who cannot go back to that time without being greeted with regret and pain. They can't listen to Throwback Thursdays on the radio without being reminded of the multiple people that they have been. The young, dreamy, aspirational person who just couldn't wait to get off those steps, jump off the porch. To that still young, walking zombie under full control of a monster that hurt a lot of people close to him. To the remains of both, who learned that an apology doesn't fix everything, as they became invisible to society. See, I can't properly describe that era if all I told you about was the cars, the music, and the fashion, and didn't tell you about the streets full of pieces. The pieces of the many and the many left to try and pick them up. The 30-year-olds who looked 60. And the men wore it better because there were many careers that could explain why a man would look so dirty, why his skin would be so arid, why his fingernails would be so lifeless, why his stench would be so bad. He must have been working hard as a mechanic or a construction worker. But the women were left with curveless bodies, raspy voices, hair that could tell a story longer than the last Avatar movie, with the same skin and fingernails and an even worse stench. They were going to be accountants and engineers, and flight attendants and nurses. They were going to coach football and gymnastics, teach English and biology, volunteer at the firehouse and soup kitchens. They were you and I. And then they weren't. And that's just the invisible people. I haven't got to the people who've disappeared. You know, the young person that went from barely being able to feed themselves, sacking groceries, working at his uncle's tire shop, working at fast food joints, to being a millionaire within a matter of weeks. We talking big gold chains, big feel of fresh, big boy lack fifth wheel on back. But then that shoebox full of cash became a shoebox full of problems. Shoebox full of shark food. Shoebox full of evidence. Chris went from sharing a life with Felicia to sharing a cell with Felipe. Felicia had Chris Jr. on the way. Chris Jr. would have Chris III before Chris rejoins their lives. Not to mention those who lost their lives in the subsequent street wars, and those who hit the pipe too hard, froze up. The reality is there aren't too many who seen Franklin Saint's success dealing drugs, but far too many who experienced his fate afterwards. I don't know a single hustler from my childhood days that was doing well by the time I left my neighborhood. They were at the store asking us, "Nephew, let me get a quota," to cover their tax on their beer by the time we hit teenage years. They used to send us to the store, tell us keep the change, and they always gave us enough money to make sure the change was worthwhile. The Cutlass looked like it ain't been washed in ages, and had a shoestring where the lock was punched in to keep the trunk from flying open. All but one ring on the right middle finger was gone from what used to appear like a fountain of gold. It was so easy for the writers to give Franklin back his money and he and the wife and the kid go live on that huge plot of land, rebuild the real estate empire, never looking back on the South Central that he helped destroy. Hell, they could have kept the money and just gave him back the wife and kid, and the story would have still been incorrect. The only way to tell the truth was to send a dirty, paranoid has-been to the store to get a paper bag covered beverage the way they did it. Because that's what really happened. People were destroyed. Families were destroyed. Communities were destroyed. A race of people was devastated. That had to be told. You know, one of the biggest tragedies in Black cinema history also took place during this time. And I'm not talking about Ricky getting hit with the double barrel in the alley. I'm not talking about Stevie Newsom getting taken out by the police after getting an AP carved into his fade. Not talking about Harold getting gunned down at the intersection or Kane meeting the same fate packing for Atlanta. Hear me clearly when I say this. The most tragic moment in Black film history was O-Dog surviving Menace to Society. No, he wasn't the main character, and the writers did a very good job of showing that lifestyle through Kane. From his early years and his upbringing, to his parents' dynamic, to being raised by his grandparents, to showing every little incident that would increase his involvement in the street life. But the movie literally starts with O-Dog shooting and killing the store owners, and it ends with O-Dog surviving a shootout that killed two of his best friends. He was an absolute menace the entire film, described in the film as the craziest nigga alive, America's nightmare, young, black, and didn't give a fuck. O-Dog went through that movie unscathed. Even when he was caught for the GTA, the judge let him off on a warning. And as intentional as the Hughes brothers were with everything in this movie, as careful as they were, it is hard for me to believe that O-Dog's lack of consequence wasn't intentional. I mean, you're talking about a movie that took place in Jordan Downs, Grape Street, purple rags everywhere. I ain't hear the word cuz the entire movie. That was no accident. There were no gang scenes in the movie. No Bloods and Crips. Even when the police dropped, Kane and Sharif off with the essays took them to the hospital. That was no accident. They wanted to make sure that whatever gang violence was brewing in the streets of LA, they weren't pouring fuel on the fire. They were going to have any gang incidents coming out the cinemas when you went to go watch Menace to Society. They were very careful with this film. But this film needed one more scene. Yeah, we needed to see O-Dog face the reality of what happens to people that go through life moving the way O-Dog was moving. We needed to see that consequence. But that didn't happen. And that decision devastated our communities. And I know some of you guys are saying it's just a movie. These are characters. It's fictional. And if you didn't grow up in the West Coast inner city, I completely understand why that would be your position. But see, when you grew up in these gang neighborhoods, when you grew up around people who would later become O-Dogs, you would understand that this is art imitating life so closely that life started imitating the art. I mean, who do y'all think these young brothers want to be? Tony Montana died. Bishop died. Nino Brown died. Doughboy died. Everybody in the red car that shot Ricky died. There's only one person that went without consequence. And he was the worst of all of them. In closing, I am so thankful that I had people in my life who cared enough to not lie to me. I was able to go through life making better decisions because of that. When my mother was really sick and in the hospital for over a month, she didn't tell me, oh yeah, I'm just a little sick, I got the flu. Mommy's stomach hurt. No, she looked into my 9-year-old eyes and said, I have alcohol poisoning. This is what happens when you drink. My uncle didn't blame his NFL career derailment on a hurt knee. He told us I was smoking weed, got kicked off the team, got kicked out of college. I started in front of a whole lot of people who made it to the NFL. My older cousin would call me from prison and reiterate that everything positive I was doing in my life was exactly what I was supposed to be doing, because he knew that the life he lived that landed him in prison was a lie. The consequences of bad decisions need to be seen so we can learn a lesson. And if we're not willing to teach that lesson, then what are we teaching?